It's 11:11 a.m. on a Tuesday, December 29th, year of our Lord 2020. Here is some dubstep. On today's Nugget of Zen, we are without healing. Hello and namaste, friends and internet family. Thank you for tuning in to today's segment. The Nugget of Zen segment is meant to be simple, concise, and direct. And to that end, let me get right to it. We are without healing. Without healing, pain becomes trauma. Without healing, trauma becomes outrage. Without healing, outrage becomes hate. Without healing, hate becomes violence. We are without healing, and we are becoming violence. Let us change that. Why are we without healing? It's one of the most profound questions of our generation. Why do we lack true, genuine spiritual healing? Now, as always, friends, I aim to avoid making broad, super generalized, absolutist, and blanket statements. So yes, I want to acknowledge here that I understand there are many healers out there. There are traditions, there are movements, there are schools. There are many who pursue a spiritual practice with the aim of achieving spiritual healing. What I'm asking is larger and more about our collective. Why doesn't the human species have a universal or global spiritual healing practice? Why are we, as individuals and as a collective, so distracted, caught up in, entangled with all the drama and materialistic shenanigans of our mundane societal world, so caught up in that we are aggressively neglecting our spiritual healing? At an individual level, at a community-wide level, at a state level, at a national level, at a global level, at a species-wide level, most of us are unaware of the cosmic calling to step into our own spiritual healing. Now, plenty of people are, and I'm not addressing that. Although, here, let me pause for a second and address a concern about the spiritual community. First things first, namaste and much love to everyone out there that is doing their best and working their practice and struggling to manifest their individual spiritual healing. On top of that, while we must, preserve space for that and be grateful that there's a lot of that going on, we must also remain vigilant, friends. And this goes out to anyone listening who is already a spiritual person, right? Already uses that kind of label, already talks about those kinds of things. This may be news to you. This may be old hat. But I think it is worth repeating regularly and spreading to as many people as possible. If you are a spiritual person and you understand that ego is not just an internal virtual phenomena of any given individual who is corrupt, but is also a cosmic function and structural element of the universe and part and parcel of our human experience, then you will readily understand that ego is dutifully playing its part. And also, because it is not just an individual phenomena of the mind, but a cosmic phenomena of the very fractal unfolding that created us, ego knows the collective spiritual path and our individual spiritual paths better than we do, and has already laid ego traps for us at every step of the way. This is important to understand and be vigilant of. Otherwise, you wind up being one of those, quote, spiritual people that is really busy patting themselves on the back for being woke and achieving their, quote, enlightenment, while simultaneously judging others as inferior, labeling them as sheeple, and spewing content that borders on hate speech. I see way too much of that from self-proclaimed spiritual people talking about how effing woke they are. We need to make space for them as a family of human beings so that they may free themselves of those ego trap burdens and refocus their attention on the actual spiritual work we're being called to do. And that's no light thing. It's a challenge. It's hard, and it is something very difficult to step into. But it is critical to understand, in my humble opinion, that healing is, and always has been, one of the central pillars, or one of the important keys, one of the secrets, quote unquote, to the manifesting of actual solutions. It's critical to actually being able to solve the problems that we have essentially created for ourselves during this time that we have been so distracted and therefore severed from our relationship to spirit, to healing, to the cosmos as it actually is. Because healing is so critical and at the center of the collective human spiritual journey, it should be no surprise to anyone that the system of oppression, the elite, the cabal, whatever you want to call it, has invested so much effort in 100,000 different ways to distract us from that spiritual calling, to distract us from our own spiritual abilities, and most importantly, to distract us from understanding that we are a deeply traumatized species that is in desperate need of some serious spiritual healing before we can progress any further on other matters. Will we ever see true freedom if we do not address the collective spiritual need for healing? That's a question that's sitting there like a big, bright pink elephant in the room. Everyone arguing and fighting about what freedom is, and so few people taking up the calling to invest in individual, collective, and species-wide spiritual healing. I get it. It's daunting. It's vague. It's bizarre. And as soon as you open that door, you are accosted by an onslaught of product and sales pitches. Buy this book. Study this program. Train in this technique. I'm not hating on those things. I'm just pointing out that maybe some of that commercialization of the spiritual practice has gone a little bit overboard and is now contributing more to the distraction than it is to the actual practices of spiritual healing. I understand that I speak from a very precarious position. I myself have aspirations to writing books about how we can work towards our own spiritual healing, right? And if I finish those books ever, they will be products that I will want to sell. So, trust, I get it. But there's also this, there's like, with all things, if I may go on a bit of a tangent, with all things, there is a conjoined duality that takes shape in a spiral. There is the virtuous spiral and its opposite, whose technical label completely, the vicious spiral, obviously, as in a vicious cycle, right? Spiritual individuals who feel compelled to share their understanding, their questions, their seeking, their discoveries, etc., will be tested by the universe by forcing this confrontation of this ego trap dilemma. Do you slide into the slippery slope of letting the business of your services take over your spiritual life? Or do you balance those things? Or do you focus mostly on the spiritual work and less on the business side? That's a whole big, difficult, challenging discussion. Ultimately, though, all I'm trying to point out to is that for anyone who is choosing to open that spiritual door, that internal room inside your mind, to then invest your focus in learning about spiritual healing, about how to work the wordless internal spiritual practices, because there are many out there. My warning is just be careful, because there's a lot of content and a lot of individuals out there that may have been well-intentioned in the beginning, but have suffered the mistake of sliding into that slippery slope. And there's an infinite array of such ego traps. Never mind the more overt, disastrous actions of the system of oppression, right? The system of oppression that we talk about and argue about and throw conspiracy theory content around is, like I've said about Trump, only a symptomology. It is not the cause of the spiritual trauma. We as a collective, going back through time, are the cause of our own collective spiritual trauma. And that's a difficult statement for many people to sort of wrap their brains around and internalize and understand without feeling attacked. But we are spiritually responsible for ourselves, for one another, for each other, as individuals, as families, as communities, as nation states, and as a species. The system of oppression, which is a symptomology of our own deeply neglected spiritual trauma from ye olde ancient days, it understands. The people involved have enough insight, right, into the cosmology and the spiritual dimensions, that the system itself, because it is not originated by the individuals involved, but rather the esoteric source, ego, The system knows that species-wide, third eye opening, transformational, and transcendent spiritual healing is one thing that would bring an end to the material system of oppression. The system knows that if we unified in collaborative, transcendental, cumulative, species-wide spiritual healing and actually fostered the reopening of our third eyes, that we would free ourselves through healing, not violence, through enlightenment, which is an infinite fractal unfolding, not a one horizon win event. You don't just become enlightened suddenly one day. Although that's a whole nother episode, because there's a lot of debate and discussion and a lot of conflicting teachings about whether enlightenment is a gradual process or an instantaneous process. It's both, just like evolution, but that's a whole nother discussion. The system knows. The system wants to prevent us from achieving species-wide, third eye opening, transformational, and transcendent spiritual healing. Therefore, the system, the NWO, the cabal, whatever your favorite label for it is, the system peddles mountains of manipulative psyop content riddled with neuro-linguistic programming that is designed explicitly for the purposes of keeping you and everyone else distracted from the cosmic, universal, spiritual calling to heal ourselves and each other. It's not new to this game. The New World Order is actually really rather ancient. Ego didn't just crop up in the last 10 years. Ego is fundamental to the very unfolding of the fabric of reality in order for human beings to exist. We're not supposed to destroy ego. That's like taking a gun and blowing your brains out and thinking that will heal you of something, right? Like, it only works in Fight Club at the end of the movie. That's the only time that works. We are supposed to heal our ego. See, that's the big flaw with that movie. Otherwise, I generally really kind of admire it. It's very satirical. It's critical of our system. It's pointing out a lot of flaws. It's not exactly providing a solution to anything, but it's definitely shaking people up to question what they're surrounded by. It's supposed to be a kickoff point, not the end goal, right? And at the end, it's deeply flawed. He theoretically heals his mental schism by taking a gun, putting it in his mouth, and trying to blow his own brains out. Perhaps, allegorically speaking, that kind of makes sense as a metaphor. But literally speaking, when it comes to our actual ego, the actual schisms in ourselves and our society and our species, that will not work. That will render us all dead. Maybe, just maybe, that might be why the system peddles so much content that normalizes and encourages the idea that violence in any way, shape, or form solves anything, which it categorically does not. It just renders death. Death, murdering someone, doesn't solve the problem. It just eliminates the person you associate with the problem. Dragging out the elite and cutting off their heads with guillotines will not solve the problem. In fact, I'm fairly convinced that at this point in time, it's the system itself that's peddling that content, encouraging that form of thinking, because they've staffed all the seats of power with people that are disposable. So if you have a revolution and you chop all their heads off and you think you've won and you think you've solved the problem, the real puppet masters are giggling and laughing and ridiculing us all the way to the bank because they profiteer on violence. And they want you to believe that violence is a solution, because with those two things combined, we perpetuate endless violence that continually and very permanently distracts us from the work we must do, the spiritual healing we must create together. So the next time you're trolling social media and you're seeing content around a wedge issue, take note. Set down which side you think is right. Forget about that part. Zoom out and look at the common talking points being peddled by both sides. And tell me there isn't a clear and obvious trend of psychological manipulation. Not to win the wedge issue, not to prove that one side is more correct than the other, but to keep making the wedge bigger. Creating more surface area for more people to step up to the wedge issue and participate in the meaningless argument created around whatever wedge issue you're talking about. Because that, like endless warfare and perpetual street violence, that keeps us distracted from our spiritual calling. It keeps us in pain. It perpetuates the trauma. It re-inspires the outrage. It breeds more and more hate, and it perpetuates escalating levels of violence. Either we step away from the cycle and focus on the new paradigm of self-healing, or we just perpetuate this treadmill, this repetitious, self-destructive pattern. You can call me crazy if you want, but I am fairly convinced, based on a lifetime's worth of seeking, questioning, researching, quote unquote, investigating. I prefer the word investigating, right? I'm not a professional researcher, and neither are most people who are parroting talking points they've picked up. I am an amateur investigator. Let's call it that. But after 30 plus years of this, of trying to observe all sides without picking a side, trying to zoom out to see the larger patterns surrounding the conflicts, trying to comprehend the problems without clinging to ideological constructs that dictate what solutions are possible, I've come to this conclusion that, and I could be wrong, but I believe, I hate that word, I am convinced, and I feel very strongly in an intellectual, emotional, and spiritual way, that we are being called to rediscover and reestablish, renormalize, and once again master, for we had this knowledge and this wisdom some time ago, the skills of healing, so that we may heal ourselves as individuals and help heal each other as members of a shared community. And of course, heal the entire species as a collective. Why is that so important? Think about this. Let this really sink in. Let this sink in and plant seeds and germinate deep down inside you. If we heal ourselves, each other, and the species, we will heal the tyrants, the evildoers, the bad guys, and those that we see as participating in the perpetuation of the system of oppression. "2020's been a challenging year. And if you've spent time during this difficult episode focusing on your healing, trying to investigate how to achieve it, and doing the hard work of that wordless spiritual practice that can only be really experienced inside of the world of your inner spiritual space, that quiet central seat of consciousness that pre-exists your personality and your life history, then I send you much praise and congratulations and what's the word I'm looking for? Just kudos and congratulations, like huzzah for that. If you spent 2020 freaking out or preoccupied with other things, this is a moment to pause, reflect, review, and make adjustments. Every day, as the cliche reminds us, is an opportunity to completely reinvent ourselves. Let's reinvent ourselves as healers. Om Shanti Metta Shanti Om Namaste. As always, as always, friends, thank you for tuning in. May you find the time to sit in silence and meditate and invest in that personal spiritual healing. As always, friends, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart. Remember, friends, your spiritual path is entirely your own. While there are some universal steps you can practice, ultimately, only you can open that door, and only you can tread the path you are meant to walk down.